everybody. We are here in Miami at the SAE Institute, and I'm with my friend Frank Socorro next to me.
Hello, everybody.
He kindly is giving some of his time to share with me and with you some of his techniques, his point of views, his hints on music engineering, mixing, and sound tailoring, and what he does when he chooses to use digital, when he chooses to use plugins, when he chooses to use analog, because this is an endless decision here. Most of us won't have an SSL 4000, at home, but a lot of times we're gonna have a couple of channels of equalizer compressors. And some people are like deciding if they're buying, analog, or if they just stick to plugins. So Frank has a lot of credits, and he's done a lot of recordings, including Amy Winehouse. What's the name of the record?
Back to Black.
That was a Grammy winning, right?
No, nominated many times. Well, it won Grammys, but I didn't get a Grammy because
it was
the record of the
songwriting.
year.
Yeah.
The record of the year we lost to Herbie Hancock.
I've been there too. I'm sure he did things on that record that could be interesting to know what those things were. So this is Frank Socorro. Thank you, Frank.
Nice to meet everybody.
Thank you for your time for
You're
us
welcome.
to do this.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
So Frank, when you start a project, I know there are different moments during a project that we can take, make decisions on when to go analog. Mm-hmm. Some people just will do everything digital and then, run stems. Some people will start all analog and then go to digital and finish there. Mm-hmm. Usually, what is your take on that?
So I think my approach has always been, what is the I guess not path, but what is the way that's going to make the project the best? Obviously, there are some projects that would definitely benefit from doing a lot of analog stuff, because there's budget and there's time, and it would just fit the sonics that are required for that type of project. But then there's projects that don't really need that stuff. So, I think my main thing is just looking at the project as a whole from the outside, one good time, and saying, okay, what kind of things do we need? Obviously, speaking with the producer and the artist, trying to find out what their end goal is, and, getting lots of references and, ideas of what it is they're trying to do, and then making that decision from there. I love analog gear, like a lot of people do, but it has a very specific sound, and sometimes people don't want that, so I base my decisions off of that.
Right.
I always try to sneak in a little bit though.
When you're like mixing by yourself, mm-hmm. Do you usually use your analog gear in your studio?
Yes. So at my personal studio, I actually have a Neve summing mixer, and I mix through it all the time. Not so much. Well, I should rephrase that. I mix through it because I'm used to how it sounds.
Right. Yeah. It's the 8816, right?
Right. I have an 8816, and I'm used to how it sounds, and I can get to the end of my mix faster.
Right.
So sometimes I'll try to just mix in the box and just monitor, through the monitor section, and it just takes me a little bit longer. There's something that I get when I push the meters into the red on that when I print back into Pro Tools, it just sounds a certain way.
Sounds readier.
Yeah, and it just gets me to the end of my mix a lot faster, and
So based on what you're saying, I assume you start your mix already running stems to that mixer.
Yes, yeah. I do it's a 16-channel sub mixer. Has 16 channels, but I only really use 8. So I use 8 4 stereo pairs.
Right. Yeah,
So
that's what I use in my
yeah,
studio too.
I don't. I could go out 16, but I feel like I've done that in the past, and it gets to be too much. So I usually break it down like drums, keys, vocals, and then sometimes I'll separate the bass, or sometimes I'll put the bass with the keys. It just depends on how big the record is, and then I always save a stereo pair for reverbs and delays. I separate all my
Yeah,
effects.
that's interesting to know, because each engineer, each producer has like their own takes.
Yeah.
Right? I also run 4 stereo pairs. I use a little SSL, and I mostly always do drums, bass, harmony, and vocal. I usually do those, and for one specific reason, because sometimes I just need to. I think they're, in my opinion, they are. If I want to make the harmony brighter, or if I want to just make the vocals brighter and the drums a little darker, I think they separate more. But I've heard a lot of different takes on stemming.
I will sometimes, and sometimes I say that to people, and they're like, "Why do you run the effects separate?" I do sometimes will create separate effects for each group. So like the drums will have their effects, the keyboards and the basses, and then the vocals will have their own effects, and then they'll come out of their separate auxes. But I also will, like on the master output of my effects, I will process that. Like I'll EQ the reverbs and the delays on the way out, and I'll also do sometimes like spatial stuff to like make it wider or narrower or darker, or just certain things that I do to it.
That you actually, it's great to do this, because we always have new ideas from what the other's saying, right?
Yeah.
And when you say you have like all your effects on a different stem, all of a sudden you can make your mix livelier or drier.
Sure, by
very
just turning
easily.
that up.
Yeah, just very easily.
And one of the reasons that I actually do that is, and I learned this just, I for a long time I worked for this producer, Salam Remy, and he worked with an engineer named Gary Noble. Gary's like super duper engineer. If you don't know who he is, you should definitely Google him. He's really cool. One of the things that they would do sometimes to make a record feel brighter is that they would brighten the reverb. So instead of like over EQing vocals and guitars and keys and just kind of making it brittle sometimes, they would just EQ the reverb, and it just gives the record this big openness.
Yeah. One thing I do on that matter is that every time I open a reverb, I open an EQ just before it.
Yep.
Every time.
Yep.
On any channel that there is an EQ, a verb or a delay, there is an EQ just before it. And I just, sometimes I need to make a vocal, let's say it's a female singer and she sounds thin in upper register, and I need to make that vocal sound a little closer to the mic, and it wasn't. I would just bring a little between 1 and 200 hertz on a short verb.
Yep.
And add to it, because then you add the body around that vocal.
That's definitely something that I'm a big fan of, is a close sounding vocal. And I'll tell you exactly why, is because in my formative years of audio, I was a very big fan of bossa nova. So all those records are always, so they have and I always love that vocal sound, which in turn has made me a really big fan of U47s, because I feel like I get that sound right away when I use that microphone on a vocal.
The proximity effect on the U47 is unique.
Yeah, it's great. So that's the kind of like, whenever I mix, I usually go for some version of that kind of sound, very close. So I'm a big fan of, and I always see, I'll get a song to mix, and somebody did a rough mix, and they just scooped all the bottom out of the vocal. And it sounds bright and kind of poppy, but there's no presence. It just sounds like it has no power. So I always kind of end up putting a little bit of that back in.
And what I feel is that when music is too bright and too edgy, too mid-rangey, especially,
it becomes fatiguing.
Yeah, you end up wanting at a point turning it down. And in my opinion, the good mixes,
you want to turn them up.
You want to turn them up. Yeah. Of course, not usually you want to turn bossa nova up. It's some types of music you just want to listen, like they were intended to be heard, right?
But I think a good mix you can turn up and it doesn't bother you.
Right, that is correct.
It won't be like fatiguing, like, oh, turn it down, I'm tired. Because when songs, because
the next step after turning down is moving to another record, exactly. Or station.
Exactly. I think I grew up in New York, and I listened to a lot of I grew up listening to hip hop mostly, but and during that time, there's a lot of people making mixtapes, and you had a lot of people making records, and just kind of EQing things haphazardly, and you ended up with these very bright, mid-rangey records. And I would remember like listening to music and just getting like, I like this song, but I'm so tired when I listen to it. Like I was just fatigued from the high frequency. Like I'd have to take my headphones off or just turn it down. Like, so like I think that kind of stuck with me as well. And I always end up with a little bit warmer kind of mix. People say that about when I work a lot, and and it goes back to, one, the Neve that I use, and just kind of my style of mixing just tends to lean in that direction a little bit more.
The problem with brightness and treble and high frequency EQing is that it's hard to go back.
Yes.
Once you go bright, going back is very difficult. I mean, you need to drink some coffee and then come back.
I mean, I get when I mix and a note that will come back. I would say most often is, can you make it a little bit brighter? And I have no problem with that, but I tend to play a little bit safe with that, just because because I know where people listen to music. Like if you listen on your headphones, bless you.
Thank you.
Listen on your headphones, you're listening on, some Bluetooth speaker at your house. It's generally going to be, a smile EQ on it.
And it's always easier to bring a little brightness in than to clean it off.
Exactly. And then I'll generally just kind of brighten overall the record. It's just like a little bit of sheen on top. So that's kind of my approach. I also don't slam records, too much. I mean, I'll hit the Neve really hard, but overall, I don't go for the loudest mix possible.
Right.
I go for like a nice balance, where when I send it to mastering,
now
they can take it to the next level.
Based on what you said, that you start your mix already running stems to the Neve. Do you insert anything on the master of that Neve from the start?
No, and that's simply because I have been looking for some pieces to add to my chain that I'm been kind of going back and forth,
shopping around.
Yes,
but you would
yes,
though.
Definitely. That's my goal. Is to. So one of the things that I'm kind of considering now is there's that Neve Portico, the master bus processor.
Right. Yeah.
I'm considering that.
I've seen it, but I haven't heard it.
I haven't heard it either, but I've heard really good things. And then some of the other things I've been considering is just I'm a big fan of the Shadow Hills plugin.
Right.
But $7,000 is a lot for a compressor. So I've been considering maybe putting a couple of things together to emulate that, because essentially that compressor is two compressors. It's like a VCA style, and and like a
Opto.
Like a Varimu together. So I've been considering like getting like a VCA and a Varimu and just daisy chain them in the stereo bus, and then maybe like an EQ or something. But I would definitely do it.
So if you would do that, how you'd probably, this would be my guess, you'd probably start your basic levels and then set the compressor and maybe the EQ in the master bus, and then follow the mix from there, right?
Yeah, I mean, typically, like right now, the way my setup is, it comes out of my interface. I use the Aurora Lynx. That's my main interface. I go out into the Neves, and then it goes out of the Neve, and I have a Burl B2 to print back through. So then I monitor the output of the Burl, and then like in the session, I'll have like an aux track with plugins already inserted, which will be like my final print.
Right.
And then usually I'll have like a compressor already.
So essentially, you do have processing in the master, because you're coming back to a 2-track where you insert some plugins.
And I'll insert stuff there. And I started, just discussing with different engineers and stuff, and I've started to kind of do that mix backwards thing, where you kind of start with the stereo bus and then you work backwards, and then you only tweak the things that really need tweaking, and you kind of get to the sound a lot faster. So I started like putting, just the normal things that I usually put on the stereo bus.
That's actually a very antique way of working that got lost in the 80s, right?
I guess, because people had more tracks, more stuff.
Back then, the other day I was talking to Al Schmidt, and he said, we were talking about Neves and SSLs, right? Because I was with him in front of the Neve at Capitol Records.
Nice.
Capitol Records. So I said, man, I love this board, but I do love SSL too. And then when I said that, he said, I can't stand SSL EQ. No, I can't stand SSL, he said. I said, well, they definitely sound, a lot edgier than Neves. Neves are a lot mellower and, fatter.
Yeah.
SSLs, have a lot more presence. It's hard to say which one is best, right?
Yeah.
And then I mentioned something about EQing. That's the funny part of the story. And he said, I don't use EQ. I said, you don't use EQ ever? He goes, Enrico, when I engineered back then, the boards didn't have EQ.
He's had to place the mic correctly, and then yeah.
So he said, well, we had like maybe EQs in the master, or we would just run the master to not even a 2-track EQ, it was a 1-track, right?
Yeah. Like a mono pull tech or something.
Right. So from based on what he said, we know that back then there was these were probably the first board that had like
dynamics, and
dynamics
built into
on
every
each channel, right? So back then you couldn't, before Pro Tools. You probably was there. You were there too. I think you're younger than me, but we didn't have compressor on every channel.
Right.
We had like a couple of compressors in the rack, maybe 4. One tube compressor for vocals, maybe a second one for something, and a few DBXs, and that was it.
Yeah.
And if we go further back on the Auschmidt era, he didn't have the EQs.
Right.
So what you're saying of starting the process all into the master fader, this is pretty amazing story, because I think this is one of the biggest questions nowadays.
Yeah.
People ask me a lot, do you insert anything on your, because I do mastering.
Okay.
And when people send mixes for me to master, they always ask, can I send my mix with anything in the master? I always say, it's your mix. Send the mix like you wish.
Right.
The only thing that I don't want you to do is to slam a limiter in the master just to make it sound louder and less dynamic range, because this is what I'm gonna do here.
Right.
But even if you did that during your mix, if you got your levels during your mix with a limiter there, please make a bounce of that too, so
you can hear it.
So I can hear what they heard. Because if it won't make any sense if they spent like 20 hours in a mix with a lot of stuff in the master, and I would just tell them, no, you can kill all of that and make the bounce of the mix. The mix won't sound like they intended.
You'd have to mix it again.
And I would never be able to achieve that again without knowing what they were hearing.
Earlier on in my career, I had a situation where, as an engineer, when you're working, like, you're always learning stuff. And I was younger, and I was working with, a producer, and he kept asking, can we make it louder, make it brighter, and I kind of felt like I had reached the limit on each track, so I just went for the master. That was like, well, where else am I going to make it louder, brighter, and I started putting stuff on the master. And he was like, yeah, louder, and I got to the point where, like, just, like, crushing it. And then, all right, bounce it, and they sent it to mastering, and the mastering guy called me back, and he was like, hey, can you take the limiter off? And I was like, yeah, no problem. So I took the limiter off and I sent it to the mastering guy, and then they sent the master back. And the producer was like, what is this? Like, this is not how we had it sounding. Like, we had it better. It wasn't necessarily that it was better. It was just, it was louder, and that's what he got used to.
Better for the music.
For him, it was better. So, I contacted the mastering engineer. I said, hey, he's really not digging the master. Can you just use the first version? He's like, I can't do anything with that. And I was like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, obviously, like, now I'm a little bit more careful, and I kind of keep mastering in mind when I'm mixing. And I kind of think that that's one of the things that's pushed me to, like, get a very loud mix that's still really dynamic. And I have my ways of going about doing that. And obviously being able to have the stems, and then also in Pro Tools being able to do a lot of parallel stuff allows me to keep a dynamic mix that's still apparently really loud. Because I always keep that in mind. That for me like stayed with me, that situation.
But what you just mentioned, apparently keeping it very loud without necessarily being. I mean, parallel compression will bring up the RMS. I mean,
because you have more stuff going on.
Because it's essentially the same without messing the transients. Because if you just use a limiter, you're squashing down the transients, and therefore you're bringing up the RMS.
Right.
Parallel compression, you're just leaving the transients untouched, and you're bringing up the RMS either way, right?
Yeah. That's a big thing for me, because the genres that I mostly work in are hip hop and R&B, and like the drums to feel like they're hitting how they should. I find that technique works best for me, especially with things like 808s and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. And what's funny? Just recently the loudness war started fading out, right? Because of thank God, because of the streamers. Yeah. Like Spotify and
they
Apple, they just made variable levels, based on a certain reference, right? Either 12 dB full scale, K14, K12. They will. Each one has its own standard, and they vary too. And I mean, not that they vary; they have varied. They have Spotify
just lowered it.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. They just, it's not. They haven't set to a certain steady level yet. Right?
Yeah, they're kind of
searching the right level to go. So, from when that started happening, and when the metering changed, I started following those rules, and I've been having a hard time to achieve the sound I want with lower masters. Because when you I'm saying all of this relating to the story you said about sending the mix to the master engineer, and that your producer was digging the other mix better. Because when you insert a limiter and you do like just 3 or 4 dB of limiting, and you bring in that RMS up, all the relation sounds different already.
Yeah, and you're also increasing harmonic content.
Exactly, because they were low and unheard, and all of a sudden they start being, perceived.
And the record sounds fuller and bigger, and and there's more stuff going on.
So mastering something and just being very easy on the drive, it's just sometimes I just have to bring the ceiling down, and I'll just have a lot of space up if necessary.
Yeah.
So I have I'm closer to the 14 or to the 12, full scale. Or you just leave it up there and let the stream do its thing, because it will be essentially the same.
Yeah.
You're gonna have like a loud master, and the stream will do its thing. What I'm trying to say is that I will never make a loud mix or a loud master for loudness, but for the sound.
Right. No, I totally agree. I kind of had the way that I came into engineering was, it's interesting because my internship, I interned for a man named Charles Dye. It's another guy, look him up, Charles Dye. He mixed Ricky Martin's Live La Vida Loca. Huge record. First record mixed entirely in Pro Tools. Ever.
And that sounds good. And
it's loud. It's really loud. And sometimes I tell Charles that it's his fault that we have the loudness wars. So he was, he had tons of stuff on the stereo bus, and that's who I learned. I was his intern and I was his assistant. I worked with Charles for, the first 2 years of my engineering. So everything I knew about engineering just for the most part came from Charles. So I was all about Pro Tools. And then as I started doing my freelance, I the studio where I worked at with Charles was all Pro Tools. It was Pro Control at the time, like the biggest Pro Tools system in the southeast of the United States, and it was just all Pro Tools. Like I was all about computers and everything. So I started working in studios, and I started running into this board more and more. Everywhere I would go, there was this board, and obviously I had learned it at school how to use it, but but I was just like always in the box, and I was like, oh, I don't need a board. And then, as time went on, I started using the board more and kind of getting used to what it was doing to the sound. And so because of Pro Tools where it was in the beginning, it was bad to clip. If you got red lights in Pro Tools, it was bad. So I brought that over to here. So I would be working on the board and I would see the red lights turn on. I'd be like, oh, I got to turn everything down.
Oh, I've been there. Turning everything down, all of a sudden it doesn't sound as good anymore. It doesn't
sound as good. And I'd be like, oh, and I'd be fighting with these mixes and I'd be fighting with all this work. I'm like, why? And now Bo was always worried about the red lights. I'm like, what? The red light? I can't turn the red light on. At one point, somebody was like, you should try mixing with the screen off. And I was just like, why? And he was
with
like,
the years on.
Yes. He was like, stop looking at the lights. Forget about the waves. Just focus on what you're listening to. If the red light turns on and it doesn't sound bad, keep moving. And then from
Can you say that again?
Yeah. If the red lights turn on and it doesn't sound bad, keep going.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I let go of that fear of the red light. Red light does not mean stop in the studio. And once I let that go, I was able to kind of move forward and get the kind of mixes loud and how I wanted to out of analog gear. And now to this day, like when I mix on my Neve, sometimes people come over and they're like, I think you're clipping. And I'm like, no, I know I'm clipping. I'm like, does it sound bad? And they're like, no, it sounds great. I'm like, so we don't have to stop. And they're like, oh, okay. And like people get it when I tell them like, it's fine. Like you can clip. You just have to know where and when to clip.
Right.
So
right.
I think that's also part of how I get like a loud mix. Like I, driving the analog gear to kind of print a louder mix and gives me the
in my opinion, the only place where you cannot clip for real is the very final master, and for one specific reason. You don't know what kind of converters will play that master, like an MP3, an iPod, an old CD player, something in a car. And some converters will not withstand, the clipping, and that will sound really bad. Yeah. But, until the sound reaches its final mastering stage, there is a lot of math and electronics and engineering, real engineering, not only music engineering. Yeah. But we got, what we hear is the final word,
Right. That point about the clipping is very important. They call it intermodal clipping or intersample clipping.
Intersample.
Yeah. So even though you might have a record that you don't see any red lights in your DAW, but there could be intersample clipping. So yeah, clip where you can. If it doesn't sound bad, keep it moving. As long as your master is not a distorted clipped master for any reason, or you don't have a really crappy sounding mix streaming out there, I think you're good. So I think in conclusion, analog is great, but so is digital, and I think they both have their place. And I think now the hybrid way of most people mix nowadays is...
Yeah, I was... okay, so for our wrapping up here, let me ask you, this... I really enjoyed all you said. I'm counter thinking with all I do and, my style of working. Do you ever choose to go in the box from beginning to end for any reason, and what would that reason be?
I have, and I think the main reason is...
Let me break in for one more, sure. One more second. A lot of people that will do in the box, not everybody, but a lot of people will do in the box. Hello, sorry. A lot of people that do in the box only, not all of them, but a lot of them will do in the box because they don't have the equipment they wanted to have, right? And they are on the way to get, to saving the money, doing their thing. But, I find myself choosing plugins over analog gear many times. And I'll just give you one more example in the middle of my question so you understand my point. I've done a lot of comparing, okay? Boosting, opening an SSL EQ on a plugin, boosting, 10K, and then coming to the analog, boosting 10K, doing that on a Neve, doing that on API. in trying that on compressors. I actually have a video on YouTube, comparing compressors. But what I came to conclude was that it's not that one band, that one compressor that will change your sound if you're using analog or digital, because the plugins actually sound pretty damn close and sometimes even better. But when you work on analog,
it's everything.
It sounds different. You know, and it's not because of this or this, or it's because of this.
All of this together.
Yeah.
It's not one ingredient. It's the entire thing. Yeah, for sure. Usually the thing with like analog or going, straight in the box is really boils down usually to budget. Does somebody have the equipment? Are they saving up for the equipment? And I think you're right in that it's not just one thing. So sometimes people think, oh, if I get this, like that's it. It's gonna like I worked at for a guy who had a nice, really nice home studio, really nice mics. It was a couple of nice mic pre's, and then he had the Manly Slam,
right,
which is a great box. And we would record stuff, and then he'd be like, "Oh, put it through the Manly," and then I'd put it through the Manly, and he'd be like, "Oh, doesn't sound like how I want it to sound." I'm like, "What do you like?" He's like, "I want like this analog like." I'm like, well, then there's a lot of missing parts. Like, you should get a console if you want that, because it's everything together. It's not that one box that you think is like the super cool analog box. It's not going to get you the same sound that you would get if you ran all your channels through a console.
It's not one box with all the magic inside, right?
It's not. It's really not. And
I usually tell people the same thing.
Yeah, and it's usually like,
people ask me, what can I get that will change my world? I go,
money. It's not one thing. I think there's a company right now that has another SSL emulation. I don't remember who it was, but maybe it's Slate. No, it's not Slate. Maybe it's soft. It's some company.
I just saw that it's BrainWorks.
It's BrainWorks. Yeah,
I just saw that this week.
Like, as you instantiate every plugin on a channel, it sounds, because they didn't emulate one channel, they emulated an entire console.
The chain.
So it's like they did, like, if you put the EQ or you put the channel strip on channel 1, the one that you put on channel 2 is not the same emulation. So it was like they modeled an entire board. So every channel sound, cause like this board, like if I ran signal through every channel on this board, they would all be a little bit different, even in levels, in the everything. Yeah. So that's what they did to try to kind of give you that more feel. I think that's the thing that people don't get. So if what you have is, the budget to get in the box and buy some plugins and buy a bundle and do that and become a better engineer. I know plenty of guys who mix only in the box and they have great mixes. Yeah. So it's just a preference.
But, regardless the budget, do you find yourself in your studio, you have the Pro Tools, you use Pro Tools, right? Pro Tools, and you have your Neve and you have your other outboard gear. Do you find yourself ever, this project or this one mix, I'm going to just start and finish in the box. I'm not even going to run stems. Do you ever do that?
I try, but I never get the outcome.
And do you find yourself going through phases? Let's say, in the past 3 months, you've been doing starting your mix, going through the stems through the Neve. But maybe 3 months prior to that, you were just running the Neve at the end of the mix, and then prior to that, do you find yourself going through phases?
I'm always adjusting my process. I've taught people before, so from teaching I've learned that you can never know everything. So I'm always like learning new stuff, and like I'll read something and I'll watch a video and somebody does something, I go, I'll try it, and if I like it I might incorporate it, and that will change the way I do things. The thing about mixing backwards, that's not that old for me. So, and then sometimes I'll go, oh, but I used to do this before, and then kind of bring that thing back and then kind of change. So yeah, it's always like.
Yeah, I love the mixing backwards thing, because I find myself doing that, but never thought of it that way with that name, mixing backwards.
It's like you start at the final, and then you kind of work your way backwards. And I find that I do less to the individual tracks.
Right.
Because you do like masters, and then you do like your groups. And then if something is really bugging you, then you go back to the individual
And you
channels.
fix that one thing instead
Yeah.
of fixing each one thing, you know, throughout
And the
whole
cool
mix.
thing about it is that you really start in the way that everybody always tells you to start a mix, which is to kind of just set the levels.
And listen to the mix, not to kick drum.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
you listen to the entire thing and you make an adjustment on the master. Oh, here's a little bit more compression. Oh, it's going to make everything kind of work together. Oh, I'm going to kind of brighten this a little bit here. And then you kind of get like this really nice rough mix. And then you go back to the groups like, oh, drum could be punchier, vocal could be brighter. Da, da, da. And then I kind of find myself once I'm there, like sometimes I'm like, that was too easy. And I have to like step away and then come back and listen. I'm like, oh, it sounds good. And then you kind of just wrap it up. But
Well, the other day, I was making a full record, a full album with a singer, right? And then I did all the vocals, and did vocal edits, vocal choosing, vocal comping, and tuning, and and then she asked me to send all the rough mixes with the vocals finished, so she could take a listen. So I spent like a few hours just bringing up rough mixes of all like 12 or 14 songs, right? So I started mixing the first song, and I went like for 2 or 3 days mixing that song, and then when I was pretty much done, I played the rough mix that I did in 5 minutes.
it sounded great.
Much better.
Yeah, sometimes too much. I get
And that has to do with your mixing backwards, because you start from that good point instead of starting from individual points.
right. I get again, because a lot of the stuff I do is R&B and hip hop. When I get a song and I get the files, the producer has been working on this track for God knows how long. They have EQ, and that's another thing. Sometimes people go, "Hey, I'm going to send you the session. Do you want me to take off all the plugins?" And I'm like, "No, send it to me exactly how you left off, and let me go from there. If you have crazy EQ on your track, I'm going to pretend that EQ is not there, and I'm going to move on from that point." Sometimes engineers will get a session and they want to like, and then start it all over, and it's like,
Yeah, it's a lot of, you run a big risk of going to a place they don't want to they don't want to be there.
So I'll get the session and I'll start from where they left off, and it's and I get what they're trying to do, and I'll usually listen. I'll see the EQ, I'll look at the EQs that they did on their plugin, and I go, okay, I get what you're trying to do. And then sometimes I'll go back and kind of tweak theirs a little bit, but rarely do I do that. I'll usually kind of just go from there and then just bring out the things that I feel like need to come out to make the record taller, wider, bigger. And then usually I get really good results that way. So I tend to go with the rough mix that was left, and I kind of just do less.
Nice. Frank, I loved hearing your stories and your techniques. They were if they were inspiring to me, they will be inspiring to a lot of other
I
people.
hope so.
Yeah, thank you for sharing
welcome.
all of this.
Cool.
Let's hope that everybody recorded. So
Thanks.
thank you, and hope to see you soon again.
Will do.